Welcome to U.S. History since 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history after Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on Gilded Age politics, patronage, tariffs, and the deadlock of federal power. The core question is this: how did Gilded Age deadlock, tariff politics, and rural unrest expose the economic pressures that later helped push Black Southerners toward migration? The core competency is to describe the immediate causes and impacts of the Great Migration. How do you govern a continental economy when voter turnout is high, party loyalty is fierce, and public office is treated as a reward system rather than as a professional administrative service? From the end of Reconstruction through the 1890s, the two major parties were so closely matched that intense participation rarely produced decisive federal action. Voter turnout often exceeded 80%, control of Congress shifted repeatedly, and no president from 1876 through 1892 established stable, consecutive popular majorities. Industrialization, railroad growth, and Western and Southern unrest accelerated, yet the machinery of national politics remained trapped in parity and patronage. The spoil system gave that paralysis its daily operating form. Winning parties distributed jobs from postmasterships to clerkships as rewards for loyalty, and urban machines such as Tammany Hall used those appointments to keep disciplined organizations alive. Politics became a system of income, access, and neighborhood management as much as ideology. The federal bureaucracy was therefore staffed through partisan relationships at the very moment the industrial economy was becoming larger and more administratively complex. The breaking point came with James A. Garfield's assassination in 1881 by Charles Guiteau, a disappointed office seeker. The killing turned civil service reform from a long-running complaint into a national emergency about competence and corruption. Congress answered with the Pendleton Civil Service Act in 1883, creating a bipartisan civil service commission and requiring competitive exams for a growing classified service. Yet even that reform carried another pressure forward, because once parties lost kickbacks from office holders, they increasingly looked to corporations and wealthy donors for campaign money. While patronage dominated the internal mechanics of politics, the tariff was the central issue of public debate. The tariff was a tax on imported goods, and in the late 19th century, it was the primary source of federal revenue. It was also a powerful tool for social and economic engineering. The Republican Party was the party of the protective tariff. Republicans argued that high duties on foreign manufactured goods protected American industries from overseas competition, ensured high wages for American workers, and allowed the domestic market to flourish. For Republicans, the tariff was a patriotic policy that built national strength and protected the American standard of living against the pauper labor of Europe. The Democratic Party, meanwhile, championed a lower tariff for revenue only. Democrats argued that high protective tariffs were a hidden tax on consumers and a subsidy for large corporations and trusts. They pointed out that the tariff increased the cost of living for ordinary families and made it harder for farmers to sell their products in international markets, as foreign nations retaliated with their own duties. For Democrats, the tariff was a tool of paternalism that enriched the few at the expense of the many. They viewed it as a violation of the principle of equal rights and a primary cause of the high prices and corporate monopolies that characterized the Gilded Age. The tariff sat at the center of federal finance. After the Civil War, customs duties collected at ports such as New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore supplied most federal income, while internal wartime taxes were gradually reduced. When rates stayed high after emergency conditions had passed, the Treasury accumulated surpluses that reached more than $100 million annually in the late 1880s. Republicans treated that stream as proof that protection worked. Democrats treated it as evidence that consumers were being overcharged so industrial interests could be insulated from foreign competition. The tariff debate was an economic argument and a conflict of regional identity. The Republican protective tariff found its strongest support in the industrial Northeast and Midwest, among factory owners, industrial workers, and commercial farmers who benefited from a protected domestic market. The Democratic low-tariff position was centered in the South and the agricultural West, where producers felt they were being sacrificed to the interests of northern industry. A voter's position on the tariff often signaled a broader choice between an industrial nation protected by federal duties and an agricultural republic suspicious of concentrated fiscal power. This debate reached its climax during the presidency of Grover Cleveland. Cleveland was the first Democrat elected to the White House after the Civil War, and he made the tariff the defining issue of his administration. In his annual message to Congress on December 6, 1887, Cleveland broke with political tradition by dedicating the entire speech to a call for tariff reduction. He argued that the federal treasury was accumulating a surplus of more than $100 million a year, money taken from the pockets of citizens through unnecessary taxes, and that this surplus encouraged wasteful appropriations and corporate favoritism. Cleveland's tariff message set the stage for the election of 1888, which became a national referendum on protectionism. Although Cleveland won the popular vote, he lost the Electoral College to Benjamin Harrison, whose victory led to the McKinley Tariff of 1890, with average duties pushed to roughly 49% on many imports. The Gilded Age presidency was characterized by high expectations and limited power. Because of the close parity between the parties, presidents often took office without a clear mandate and faced a divided Congress. Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison, and William McKinley were all men of personal integrity and administrative skill, but they operated inside a system of persistent deadlock. A president might achieve a minor victory on civil service or a specific tariff schedule, but the fundamental structure of the economy and the growing power of corporations remained largely outside their control. The presidency was often a defensive office, focused on managing the patronage machine and maintaining party unity in a volatile electoral environment. Factional warfare inside the Republican Party made that instability worse. Stalwarts defended old-style patronage and rallied behind figures such as Roscoe Conkling, while half-breeds backed a more limited reform line under James G. Blaine and other rivals. Garfield entered office in March 1881 trying to balance those camps. Then Charles Guiteau shot him at a Washington railroad station on July 2nd after convincing himself he deserved a consulship for campaign work. Garfield died on September 19th, and Chester A. Arthur, once a Conkling ally and custom house man, took office under intense pressure to show that federal appointments could no longer operate as personal spoils. That sequence did more than produce sympathy. It made exam-based hiring politically possible. The Pendleton Civil Service Act of January 1883 therefore changed government through its mechanics as much as through its rhetoric. The law created a 3-member Civil Service Commission, placed about 10% of federal jobs in the classified service at first, and required competitive examinations for those positions. It barred office holders from being fired for partisan reasons, and outlawed compulsory political assessments on covered employees. Presidents could expand the classified list by executive order, which meant reform could grow gradually even when Congress refused a broader restructuring. Yet the law also narrowed the stream of patronage money that had financed party organizations, pushing both parties toward business donors, tariff-protected manufacturers, and corporate campaign treasuries. The election of 1884 illustrates the intense and often personal nature of Gilded Age politics. Grover Cleveland, a reformer known for his vetoes of wasteful spending in New York, faced the Republican James G. Blaine. Blaine was a charismatic leader, but was dogged by allegations of corruption related to railroad land grants. The campaign became a contest of character rather than policy, marked by the famous slogan, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" referring to Cleveland's fathering of a child out of wedlock, and the Republican counterattack on Blaine's integrity. Cleveland's narrow victory was made possible by the mugwumps, Republicans who were so disgusted by Blaine that they crossed party lines to support the Democrat. This volatility showed that even a small shift in voter sentiment could decide the fate of the national government. Benjamin Harrison's term in 1889 to 1893 saw the Republicans briefly break the deadlock. With control of both the White House and Congress, they passed a wave of legislation, including the McKinley Tariff, the Sherman Antitrust Act, and the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. However, the aggressive Republican agenda triggered a fierce backlash. Voters in the 1890 midterms and the 1892 presidential election decisively rejected Harrison and the billion-dollar Congress, returning Cleveland to the White House. This pendulum effect meant that any party that attempted bold action risked immediate electoral punishment, especially when tariff schedules, silver purchases, and pension spending were translated into higher prices or larger deficits at the local level. By the early 1890s, rural organizations were building an alternative channel of pressure. The Southern Farmers Alliance, the Northwestern Alliance, and cooperative exchanges tried to reduce dependence on merchants, railroads, and local banks. Speakers, newspapers, and traveling lecturers carried demands for railroad regulation, an expanded money supply, and the sub-treasury plan into county meetings from Texas to Kansas. When delegates gathered at Omaha in July 1892, the People's Party translated that organizing work into a national program of direct election of senators, a graduated income tax, public control of transportation and communication, and easier credit for producers. The Populist challenge showed that parity between Democrats and Republicans no longer contained the anger generated by debt, freight, and tariff politics. The deadlock was exacerbated by the Supreme Court, which frequently used the doctrine of freedom of contract and a narrow interpretation of the Commerce Clause to strike down state and federal attempts at regulation. The court viewed the corporation as a person under the 14th Amendment, entitled to the same legal protections as an individual. This judicial philosophy created a no man's land in which neither the states nor the federal government felt authorized to govern the massive new industrial entities. The Gilded Age politician was therefore caught between a public that demanded protection from monopoly and a legal system that protected the corporation from the state. The result was a political culture that was high in drama but low in transformative results. When Grover Cleveland sent his December 1887 annual message to Congress, he used the presidency to force tariff policy out of committee routine and into open partisan combat. He gave the entire message to one subject, knowing every word would be read by industrial lobbies, Democratic reformers, and Republican editors preparing for 1888. Cleveland called excessive tariff collection extortion and theft, then described the surplus as a hoarding of the people's money that invited unnecessary and extravagant appropriations. He chose prosecutorial language because he wanted the tariff treated as a system of organized privilege rather than a neutral revenue device. Cleveland aimed those lines directly at Republican protectionism. He attacked monopoly and the accumulation of wealth in a few hands, and then drove the point into household economics. The laborer with his family must be fed and clothed, and if his wages are so adjusted that they only suffice for his maintenance, he is not benefited by a law which increases the cost of his living. That sentence was written for wage earners, farmers, and urban consumers who paid higher prices while manufacturers collected shelter behind the tariff wall. The message also fixed Cleveland's own governing creed on the public record. He called for tariff reduction to the actual needs of the government and tied that demand to sound money, low taxes, and restrained administration. As a Bourbon Democrat, he treated selective protection as a misuse of state power on behalf of favored industries. His language cast the federal government as an umpire that should collect necessary revenue and refuse to distribute market advantages through statute. Republicans immediately recognized the threat and the opportunity. By branding Cleveland a free trader and a servant of British interests, they turned his message into campaign ammunition. The tariff debate then moved into rallies, pamphlets, newspaper exchanges, torchlight processions, and the 1888 electoral map. Cleveland had clarified the issue in the text he sent to Congress, and that clarity hardened the partisan fight instead of resolving it. The persistent failure of the two major parties to answer Western and Southern grievances opened political space for the People's Party. Through Farmers Alliance networks in Kansas, Nebraska, Texas, and the Cotton South, Populists demanded direct election of senators, a graduated income tax, secret ballots, federal sub-treasury plans, railroad nationalization, and free silver in the 1892 Omaha Platform. Their program made clear that tariff schedules and patronage offices were no longer enough to contain an economy shaped by freight rates, debt, and concentrated capital. The election of 1896 forced a national choice. William Jennings Bryan and the Democrats embraced free silver and much of the populist critique, while William McKinley and the Republicans defended the gold standard, protective tariffs, and a tighter alliance with industrial and financial power. McKinley's victory broke the long period of party parity, but it did not dissolve the problems that had produced populism in the first place. It changed which coalition would manage them. Pendleton, the Interstate Commerce Act, and later progressive reforms all grew out of this deadlock, yet the central tension remained. As party machines weakened, campaign finance and administrative power did not disappear. They shifted into new forms. Corporate contributions, expert commissions, and regulatory boards began to carry responsibilities that party patronage networks had previously handled badly. That leaves a harder question than whether Gilded Age politics was noisy or corrupt. If high participation can coexist with policy paralysis, and if reform cleans up patronage only by pulling money and influence toward larger private interests, then the civic problem is still open. What kind of democratic state can govern an industrial economy without becoming dependent on the very powers it is supposed to discipline?
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.